Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Books and Books. My name is Phil Harley. I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities at UM. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to the first UM Humanities Center sponsored book talk of the 2024 spring semester. So thank you all for coming out in a wonderful turnout tonight. I want to it's my pleasure to introduce Daniel Pels, who is going to introduce our speaker this evening. Dan is a professor of religious studies and history, currently interim chair of the Department of Religious Studies and the director of the Masters of Arts in Liberal Studies program. He's the author of numerous books and articles, including most recently 10 Theories of Religion from Oxford University Press, which is now in its fourth edition and counting. Other books include Introducing Religion, Victorian Lives of Jesus, and many articles. So, Dan, I can't see you out here, but oh, there you are. Okay, make your way to the podium. Thanks, everybody.
Good evening. I didn't mean to be in hiding over there with Don. Fine. Can you all hear me well enough? Not that I'm important, but for when Professor Beck comes here, I hope the mic works for all of you. Our speaker this evening, Hermann Beck, is a historian of modern Europe and Germany with particular interest in political, intellectual, and diplomatic history. He is currently professor of history at the University of Miami, where he has been teaching and has been my longtime colleague since 1990. I almost misread and said 1900, so I'm quite glad that I said 1900. Hermann received his PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles, and after studying at German universities, Mannheim, Freiburg, and Berlin, and also the London School of Economics and the Sorbonne. So he has made the circuit of European great universities. He has been a Fulbright Scholar, a fellow of the Berliner Historische Kommission, and a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. You'll recognize that institutional name for sure. He is also a recipient of a teaching award at the University of Miami. Hermann has written and edited several books, including a book on 19th century Germany, the origins of the authoritarian welfare state in Prussia, conservatives, bureaucracy, and the social question, 1815 to 1870. This study focuses on Prussian conservatives and Prussian officials in their attempt to solve the social problems of German lands, particularly Prussia. Hermann's next book on the early Nazi period, The Fateful Alliance, German Conservatives and Nazis in 1933, The Machtergreifung in a New Light, examines the complex relationship between German conservatism and National Socialism. This work reveals the existence of a strong anti-conservative component in Nazism and challenges the widely held but erroneous assumption that National Socialism was an extreme manifestation of rightist politics. Instead, Hermann demonstrates that it was a social-political hybrid that combined violent opposition to the left with a fervent resentment toward the German bourgeoisie. Hermann's other publications include The Dissolution of Weimar Democracy and the Establishment of the Third Reich, and more than 20 articles on topics such as German conservatism, German socialism during the age of Bismarck, the Prussian bureaucracy, anti-Semitism, fascism, and the Nazi seizure of power. Hermann has been a very busy scholar. These articles have appeared in edited collections in leading American, British, and German journals. Those of you who are academics in the audience will recognize names like the Journal of Modern History and the Journal of Contemporary History. These are first-rate forums in the discipline. Given Hermann's scholarly expertise in German conservatism, Weimar, the Nazi seizure of power, and anti-Semitism. He's been asked to contribute book chapters to the Oxford History of the Third Reich and the Cambridge History of Anti-Semitism. This evening, Hermann will speak to us about his new book, as you can see on the screen, Before the Holocaust, Antisemitic Violence and the Reaction of German Elites and Institutions During the Nazi Takeover, recently published by Oxford University Press. Based on a wealth of archival sources and documentary evidence from more than 20 German archives, and many a day he's told me about where he has burrowed into the dusty archives to find what needed to be found. This book revises the standard assumptions that physical violence against Jews began fully in 1938 before escalating into the mass murder of the Holocaust. The book also throws a powerful and revealing light on the reaction of German elites to this violence, which began already in the early months of 1933. It's my pleasure to give you my longtime friend and academic colleague, Hermann Beck.
Well, thank you very much for your kind words, Dan. May I ask, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks also to Phil and to Omi, to Christina for setting everything up so nicely. I'm delighted to see that so many of you could come this afternoon or early evening. It's always terrible to lecture in front of an empty hall, and so I'm delighted that the room is full. Well, let me begin by saying a word about the intellectual and emotional background of this book. Now, we've all heard about anti-Semitic violence in Germany. And the one example that springs to mind is the Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. We all know that. The Reichswide pogrom in November 1938. More than 100 people were killed, 27,000 transported to concentration camps, shops were ransacked. It happened in full public view. And when we think of Nazi anti-Semitism, we think of the Kristallnacht. When I first heard about it, and the same probably happened to you, the natural question was, well, why didn't anyone protest? Why didn't anyone try to stop it? And of course, the historians among us know, but people couldn't, because this was a watertight dictatorship, and if you had protested, well, the next morning the Gestapo would have picked you up, and that might well have been the end of your career and your life. Now, as Stan said, the current narrative is that anti-Semitic violence began very gradually. In other words, when you read history books, you are told at the beginning there was virtually nothing, and then it rose very, very gradually. I found that this was not so. And in fact, while doing the research for a previous book, here Dan mentioned it, on German conservatives and Nazis in 1933, at one point I was really astonished and I thought, well, that can't be. There were hundreds of pleas for help from conservative German Jews who wrote to the Conservative Party headquarters and said, well, we're being attacked here, shop windows are smashed, terrible things are happening. And I thought, no, that can't possibly be. Well, simply because there was nothing in the literature. Then I dug further and went to other archives, looked at recompensation claims, at the documents of the British military government in Germany after 1945. As Dan mentioned, I went to more than 20 archives, also local and regional archives, and I found that indeed there was an enormous wave of anti-Semitic violence in March and April 1933. That's truly astonishing. And let me tell you why it's astonishing, because otherwise you might say, well, big deal, Nazi Germany, anti-Semitic violence, of course. Point number one reason why I was really astounded was because there was little anti-Semitic violence during the Weimar Republic. And as we all know, the Weimar Republic ended when Hitler was appointed Chancellor, January 30th, 1933, on Monday at 11 o'clock. And only 5 weeks later, this wave of anti-Semitic violence began. It began immediately after the March elections, after the elections of the 5th of March. So a mere 5 weeks. That was truly astonishing. Second point, as I already said, it's not mentioned in the literature. And so I thought, how could this happen? I mean, how was it possible that this was overlooked? Well then, again, as I mentioned, I went to various archives and assembled just the raw material. And the first 250 pages of this book really deal with the violence. More about this in a moment. And the remaining 250 pages talk about the reaction to violence. Now, the first question you will have is, well, what are we talking about? What are the numbers? I mean, how many people were killed and how many attacks were there? Well, the answer is we have no numbers. The German government, of course, tried to minimize the attacks, the new Nazi conservative government. So there are no governmental statistics. Also, I mean, Germany at the time was in the throes of a revolution. Let me show you what I mean. By the way, this is an SA man, and you can see here the armband Hilfspolizei. In mid-February already, 50,000 members of the SA and SS were conscripted into the auxiliary police. So in other words, if you were attacked and called the police, someone like this nice gentleman here might appear. What the point is going to make? You see, this is Germany during the Weimar Republic, a federal state, and in all German states, beginning in Prussia, the police had been instructed not to help German Jews if attacked. That's not unimportant for the continuation of my story. So I was saying, there are no governmental statistics, we have no official numbers. We have one number from an American journalist, Michael Williams, who visited Germany in April and May 1933. And he then wrote an article in the New York Times, published in July, and he said, well, that is his guesstimate. It's not based on any statistics. According to him, there were 3,000 violent incidents and about 300 deaths. On the basis of my research, these figures look likely. I also found maybe 2,000 to 3,000 incidents, but only about 100 to 120 deaths. Still, it's a gigantic figure. If we look at the total number of murders in Germany at that time, I have a figure here from 1931. In 1931, in Germany, there were 1,665 cases of murder and manslaughter. So imagine a figure of 300 murders. That's a substantial slice of the total number. So a gigantic figure. But let's be specific and let's continue and go into concrete detail. You will ask, well, what was this violence? So we have to say it was directed against two distinctly different groups. The first victims were the so-called Ostjuden. These were foreign Jews. There were about 98,000 living in Germany, mostly from Poland. They had Polish citizenship, but they preferred to stay in Nazi Germany. And in their entire appearance, in a sense, well, they looked foreign. Many of them had long beards, they spoke Yiddish, so they were an easy target for the SA. And they really were the first victims. Attacks on them, as I said, began in early March. There were raids on restaurants, smashing of shop windows, robbery, extortion, kidnapping, a great deal of property damage, also attacks on synagogues. And, quite often the SA, meaning the Stasi stormtroopers, carried out these attacks for sheer amusement. So they cut off people's beards or singed the beard And, in general, tortured, for lack of a better word, hundreds of these people. And let's see, here we can see the regional distribution. The Ostjuden, these Eastern Jews, they mostly lived in Berlin, the big cities of Saxony, the Ruhr, and also in the Rhine-Main area in Munich. And so here you can see, so this is about 150 incidents, already over 1,000 incidents here. The brown circles, violence against German Jews. The yellow square, forced shop closures and boycotts. Now, I'll talk about this in a moment. Of course, we are all familiar with the nationwide boycott of April 1st, 1933. Now, that really was only the tip of the iceberg, because locally, many boycotts continued, and in fact, also boycotts of Jewish shops in Germany went back to the 1890s, so they had a long tradition in Germany. What else do we have? And then we also have pillory marches. Let me be a bit more systematic and go over this and also explain what it meant. So, now we come to point number 2, attacks on German Jews. Now here, the number of unknown cases was much higher. Why? Well, because, when a Polish Jew was attacked, he would go to his consulate, make a report, and then the Polish consulate would complain to the German Interior Ministry. So there is a neat paper trail. In the case of attacks on German Jews, unless he went to the police, which didn't always happen, there is no paper trail. What happened in practice? What were the different categories of anti-Semitic crimes? Number 1, as we said, boycotts. And as I also just intimated, we all know the famous day of the boycott, April 1, 1933, but in many places it continued long after that. Also, and that's completely unknown, German civil servants after April 1st were not allowed to buy in Jewish shops. Also Nazi Party members also were not allowed to do this. Now you might say, well, why would a Nazi Party member want to buy in a Jewish shop? Well, because it was often better and cheaper. And, these were great stores of long standing. So there was a kind of insidious continuation of the boycott after April 1st. Second category of attack, abduction. And that was quite frequent. What happened was that Jewish businessmen, Jewish doctors, lawyers, anyone who had ever fallen foul of the Nazis, was abducted, brought to the, wild concentration camps of the SA. These were sort of torture cells. And there they were held for days or weeks, tortured, and they were told that upon release, they had to leave the country or else they would be killed. I found, for example, one case, the case of a Berlin neurologist, Fritz Fraenkel. He was arrested by a group of SA men because he was close to the SPD, to the sort of Democrats. He was then, abysmally treated for about a week, then let go, severely injured, fled with his wife and small child to Switzerland, and from there wrote a lengthy report of his sufferings to the German consul in Bern, in Switzerland. I'll leave the gory details out here, but in my book you'll find them. And, the inventiveness of these Nazi torturers is truly astonishing. Also, I found other cases of people who were told to leave and did not leave, and then were actually killed. Next category, the perfidy ordinance. In mid-March, the Nazi government passed the so-called Heimtücke-Verordnung. That perfidy ordinance, the Heimtücke specified that rumors that were harmful to the reputation of the Reich would be punished with prison terms. In other words, if you told your friend, you heard that recently in Frankfurt a number of Jewish shopkeepers were arrested, well, that might cost you very much. I mean, that could get you in real trouble. You might be fined, or you may be thrown in jail. And under this perfidy ordinance, German Jews were dealt with far, far more severely than ordinary Germans. I have a chapter on this, also full of terrible detail. Next point, pillory marches. We probably don't know what that is. These were Prangermärsche, like in the Middle Ages. So what happened? Let me get a picture. And that's the boycott. That's one example of such a pillory march. This is another one. So here it says, I'll never again complain with the police. What happened to this? This is in Munich. That's a lawyer, and he had been beaten up and then went to the police and complained. And then he was sort of marched through the streets of Munich by a posse of Nazi stormtroopers. Passers-by were looking on. And in some instances, I found Prangermärsche where people actually pelted rotten tomatoes or potatoes or whatever they had at the victim. This was initially a medieval form of punishment, quite widespread, also quite public, because a number of these Prangermärsche were actually recorded in the newspapers. So I found newspaper clippings from April, May, mentioning these Prangermärsche. So in other words, no German really could claim, after 1945, I didn't know about this. If he was literate and read newspapers, he must have known. Also, there was branding of a different kind. In many local newspapers, I found, and this was especially, pernicious, names, addresses, and professions of citizens who had amorous relationships with German Jews. So we would say, recently we have seen that Herr Müller received his little girlfriend, Frau Rosenthal, at 17 Burgstraße. Typically not Nazi methods. The private realm was eliminated. Everything was brought out into the open, made public. That really was a hallmark of the beginning dictatorship. Eliminate the private realm and make everything public, as in a Prangermarsch or as in this kind of, dragging private matters out into the open. Finally, there were the murder cases. Interesting. In German law, murder is an Offizialdelikt, in other words, the police, whether they want to or not, they have to search for the murderer. In a number of cases, the actual murderer was apprehended very quickly and arrested. Well, they were apprehended quickly because, these Nazi stormtroopers, they didn't try to dissemble. They made no bones about their ultimate goals. And so, 2 days later, they were apprehended and arrested, but then let go again under an amnesty from July. So all of these Nazi murderers had to be let go under the amnesty, and the public prosecutor somehow had to finagle it that it was somehow looked lawful to let these people go. Give you one example. In April, a dairy merchant in Wiesbaden, Max Kassel, was murdered. He had fallen foul of a prominent Nazi. They didn't initially want to murder him, but they went to his apartment. He was a strong man, defended himself vigorously, and the 2 or 3 Nazis sent to kill him, couldn't quite overwhelm him, so one of them drew his gun, shot him. I found his file under the heading Max Kassel, Kommunist in Wiesbaden. A communist in Wiesbaden, a dairy merchant who was quite well off. How can he be a communist? So this then was how the German bureaucracy dealt with these cases. Besmirch the victim, minimize the attack, make the victim look culpable so that the Nazi attackers don't look too bad and so that the public prosecutor can let them go. This is in part 2 of the book, where I have detailed chapters on how the bureaucracy, the judicial bureaucracy, dealt with this. Okay, murders. In any case, I found materials on enough murder cases to categorize the murder cases into 3 different rubrics. There were murders committed on the spur of the moment, as in the case of Max Kassel, for example. Then there were the many, many murders shot while trying to escape. Typical Nazi thing. They apprehended the communist, they wanted to kill him, but couldn't quite kill him. So what they did was, they moved him from one prison to another one. In the middle of the forest, the prison car stopped. He was told to get out, run. He ran, and he was shot while trying to escape. Some of you may have seen this very famous Austrian film, Hanussen. Remember? In the 1980s, early 90s, about this clairvoyant in Nazi Germany. And at the end of the film, Hanussen, meaning the clairvoyant, was shot in this fashion. Basically told at gunpoint to run, he ran, and then was shot. And finally, number 3, the revenge murders. And these often were, perfectly innocent citizens or SPD politicians who just had the misfortune of falling foul of some Nazi before Hitler came to power, before 1933. Okay, again, let me emphasize there is a big, big difference between this new type of anti-Semitic violence that began on the 5th of March and then petered out in May and June, and anti-Semitism during the Weimar Republic. Anti-Semitic crimes during the Weimar Republic were punished, and perpetrators actually then had to serve jail time. But in any case, if they were apprehended, they were punished. Now, the authorities turned a blind eye. Before I continue, maybe a word on how contemporaries evaluated this anti-Semitic violence. By the way, am I still audible in the back here? Can you all hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
A number of interesting contemporary voices. Some of you may know the book Defying Hitler by Sebastian Haffner, German journalist who fled to England in 1938, and his memoir on his youth in Germany, entitled in English Defying Hitler, became a bestseller. All my students have to read it. It's really well written, wonderful book. And he says, the Nazi organizations used anti-Semitic attacks so that members could excel within their peer group. In other words, it was a kind of initiation rite in a Nazi gang. If you wanted to show that you were very zealous, very convinced Nazi, you would make sure to tell everyone that you had severely wounded or beaten up or even killed a Jew. Max Horkheimer, a very famous sociologist, he said, anti-Semitic attacks are used as a means of intimidating the population at large. He said, politically speaking, pogroms are aimed at the onlookers. When you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Because anyone in Nazi Germany, everyone was aware that the Jews were in danger, were freiwillig, so to speak, could easily be attacked. And this shocked everyone. Well, better be careful. We don't want to fall foul of these people. So it had a clear function. Okay, now let's go on to part 2, reaction. Remember, I told you earlier, one reason why I was greatly astonished at the volume of anti-Semitic violence was because I thought, well, I know this period relatively well, but I don't know anything about protests. I never saw any protest against this. So let's have a look at protest and the reaction of German elites. First, we have to say, individual protest was already difficult in March. Why? Because social and political prominence was no shield against Nazi attacks. I mean, it's unbelievable, but from the very beginning, the Nazis were not afraid to attack prominent individuals. For example, there were house searches in the house of President Ebert's widow. Those of you who know the Weimar Republic might recall that the first president was Friedrich Ebert, Social Democrat, very prominent person. In early March, Ebert died in 1925. His widow was still alive. Her house was searched in early March 1933. Einstein's empty house, because he was in America, was also searched. So, in other words, if you had a prominent name, if you were a rich person, a high state functionary under the old regime, it did not protect you. Therefore, it would have been risky for any individual to speak out openly. And few people are heroes. You also have to think of your family. You might lose your job. So we'll grant that. Individuals could not have protested and really only at immense risk. But political parties or institutions still could have spoken out. There were not many. There were not many because the speed of the Nazi takeover was enormous, was very rapid, as we saw here. This charming gentleman, where is he? Here. This already began in mid-February 1933, that Nazi stormtroopers were integrated in the Prussian police force. Then, shortly thereafter, 2 weeks later, on the night from the 27th to the 28th of February, the Reichstag burned down. And most people believed that this was done by communists, and this also was the official Nazi narrative. As a result, the Communist Party was outlawed, and the Nazis got far-reaching legal powers. That is to say, civil rights were suspended, indefinite detention of opponents was legalized, concentration camps, not annihilation camps, were built, and in fact their opening was announced in the newspapers on the 21st of March. A unit paper openly announced tomorrow the Dachau concentration camp will open. It was a former munitions factory, so this was all widely known. In mid-March, the German states, not yet in Nazi hands, back to our little map here, were also overtaken by the Nazi government. You see, of these states, some were not governed by the Nazi Party when Hitler became Chancellor, such as Baden, Württemberg, Hesse, Hamburg, Saxony, Bavaria. All of these states were taken over very quickly in mid-March, between the 5th and the 15th, on the basis of this Reichstag fire decree. And finally, on the 23rd of March, an enabling act really sealed the dictatorship. I mention this to tell you, to impress on you, that protest was perilous, even for institutions, but it would be possible. So now let's be specific and let's look at which political parties and which institutions might have protested. Political parties. Of course, that's the most natural political agency, so to speak, to protest. German Jews were traditionally close to the Social Democratic Party and to the liberal parties. Well, both were not able to protest because, in a manner of speaking, their own heads was on the block. The Liberal Party, the Left Liberal Party, had shrunk to the size of a splinter party. The Social Democrats were still strong, still the second strongest party, but they were fighting for survival. Among political parties, it really was only the DNVP, the Conservative Party, Hitler's alliance partner, these guys here, on which I wrote another book, Hitler's coalition partner, small party, 8% of the electorate. They had the power to protest, but they used it very sparingly. I have one chapter about the DNVP in the book. Another power center, the army. The Reichswehr. It's very small, only 100,000 men, but highly professional, hugely respected, and of course, as we know from World War II, the beginning stages, tremendously efficient. I went to the archives, the German Army Party archives in Freiburg, and found very little. And in fact, the upshot was they were not interested. German soldiers just couldn't care less. I then also in another archive found hundreds of questionnaires in which German generals after World War II had been asked, what did you not like about the Nazi Party before Hitler came to power? And you know, the German generals wrote, too boisterous, too loud, too violent. One general wrote, in my opinion, they put too much emphasis on racial issues. So that was the only criticism of Nazi anti-Semitism. In other words, the army really wasn't interested. Next, power center, the bureaucracy. The German bureaucracy, the Prussian bureaucracy had a long tradition going back to the 18th century, and especially during the last phase of the Weimar Republic. The bureaucracy was all powerful, and see, all of these complaints came to them. So they could have made a difference. They could speed things up or procrastinate. And as I already said, German bureaucrats, for the most part, made an effort to make Germany look good. Minimize the attacks. If there was no excuse for an attack, well, then slander the victim. And I think I gave you the example with Max Kassel, who then was turned into a communist to basically excuse the attack on him. Well, in any case, I have a long chapter on the bureaucracy. I think one of the most interesting chapters, because you see, German bureaucrats, in a sense, took pride into their Rechtsstaat, the rule of law. Now you might say, well, Germany doesn't have much of a democratic tradition. Very true. But let's not mix up democracy, which really, German democracy only began in 1919 with the Weimar Republic, and the rule of law. The rule of law in Germany and in Prussia, by the way, Prussia is that here, the blue state, accounting for almost 2/3 of Germany's size and Germany's population. Prussia had a Rechtsstaat tradition going back to the 18th century. There is this very famous case, remember Frederick the Great, who had an argument, property dispute, between himself, the Prussian king, and a miller. And the High Prussian court in the 1870s ruled against the king. And Frederick the Great lost the property dispute. So there was this Rechtsstaat tradition. And I expected that German bureaucrats would somehow try to defend it somehow. But there was very little sign of it. Then, who else could have protested? It may surprise you, but the Christian churches. The Protestant Church and the Catholic Church. If we look at the German population in 1933, 67 million, about 2/3 of them, or let's say a little over 60%, were Protestant. 40 million were Protestant, and they saw, German Protestants considered themselves to be the conscience of the nation. I mean, these people, especially the Protestant church elite, were tremendously self-confident. They really felt in charge of the whole thing, especially in Prussia. These people, of course, as I said, they considered themselves to be the conscience of the nation, and they would, I assume, their first duty would be to speak out against injustice. So I have 3 long chapters about the Protestant Church, and I think my best really. Also, we have to keep in mind the Protestant church hierarchy, the top level, the high echelon level. They were under pressure. They had received hundreds of complaints from their own brethren saying, Bishop, this Generalsuperintendent was the Prussian title, do something, act. Also, there was pressure from the World Congress of Churches, so they were under pressure to act. Initially, a number of people seemed about to speak out, and then finally, at the end of April, on the 26th of April, the 40 highest officials in the Protestant Church came together in Berlin in a meeting, very long meeting, and we have the precise minute, and they discussed this problem. In the end, of 39 people present, one voted in favor of protest. The Bavarian church official, who then later, during the war, converted to Catholicism. Because he was so unhappy about his Protestant surroundings. Now you might say, well, why? What were the arguments? How could they, in this situation, how could they defend inactivity? Here are the arguments. And this is truly astounding. I was astounded. Number one, and that I think was that was the main reason why they were quiet. Many were content with the present government. So some people said, well, finally, we have an Obrigkeit again, meaning a government we can respect. Also, they said, Hitler, he just saved us from falling under the communist yoke. In other words, Nazi policies were wholeheartedly, even passionately endorsed. Reason number two, fear. Fear of alienating an increasingly popular regime. And this fear really was all pervasive. And again, I remind you of our friend here. These people were omnipresent. Number three, obvious satisfaction about the fact that foreign infiltration, meaning the taking over of high position by Jewish Germans, had finally been stopped. So many church people, as if they had not known that German Jews often occupied high positions in banking and in the press and so on, said, well, after I see these figures, I finally realized the government had no other option. They had to act in this way. By the way, and I mentioned this the other day in another meeting we had about this, please keep in mind that German Jews were excellent citizens. On average, the average German Jew, there were about 560,000 in 1932-33 when Hitler came to power. On average, they paid 3 times as much in taxes as the average Protestant and 6 times as much as the average Catholic. Why? Well, because they had well-remunerated positions and they paid their taxes. So they were very good citizens. And here, these church leaders were happy that now finally a lid has been put on their lives. So, in other words, the reasons why Catholic church leaders did not protest was a combination of strong anti-Jewish prejudice and genuine administration for the accomplishments of the national revolution, meaning, Hitler's new government. And by the way, that point really astonished me. Of course, I knew about and expected the anti-Semitic prejudice, but I had not expected the very obvious contentment with the new regime. And by the way, if you sort of know the period well, it's surprising, because quite often in these hundreds and thousands of skirmishes that occurred in February, March, and April 1933, very often conservatives also were at the receiving end. It happened quite often. I remember when I first, and this was the reason for this book, when I first saw documents about brawls, about street fights between conservatives and Nazis. And I thought, that can't be. Nazis and conservatives, they're hand in glove. They weren't. Oh no. So even though, it happened that conservatives too and conservative party members were beaten up, they still stood behind the regime very firmly. And by the way, the same is the case with the Catholic Church. Adolf Bertram, the leading cardinal the Archbishop of Breslau, the primus inter pares of the German Catholic Church, didn't do anything. Throughout March, sat still, and then 2 days before the boycott, he said, well, you all heard about this new boycott. Shall we intervene? So in other words, he wrote to the other 5 German archbishops in a pastoral letter. And just to make sure that he gave them a little bit of guidance, he said, well, I don't think so. That I think we should not intervene, because such a step might be considered interference in a field that does not concern us. Also, it might hurt us, it might hurt the stage. And in the past, had not, I'm quoting, the largely Jewish-dominated press consistently observed silence when Catholics in different countries were persecuted. Well, given these guidelines, the other archbishops also fell into line and nothing happened. Again, of course, it's far more complicated than this simplistic schema that I'm offering you here. You have to keep in mind, there were hundreds of Catholics, and I make this clear in my chapter, who were writing to their bishops and saying, we should act, we should do something. Then also, in the course of the Third Reich, many of these people changed. Cardinal Faulhaber in Munich, who in 1933 was very quiet, didn't say anything, during the war actually spoke out and narrowly escaped confinement to a concentration camp. So, there are many shades of grey in the picture. Okay. Let me come gradually to an end. Let me just make maybe 2 more points. One point I thought was interesting. A colleague who actually read the whole book wrote to me after reading it, and he said, would protest really have made a difference? I'm not sure. Given the fact that the Nazis really already were so strongly in control. Now here I have a quotation that refutes that. I think all of you know Konrad Adenauer. Remember him? Konrad Adenauer, first German Chancellor. He was Lord Mayor of Cologne from 1919 to 1933 when the Nazis came to power. After World War II, he became the first Chancellor of the German Federal Republic. In fact, he stepped down when he was 87 years old. And Adenauer, practicing Catholic, wrote to a friend in February 1946. Now, keep in mind, 1946, Cologne looked like a football field, completely leveled. The cathedral still stood, but otherwise, it was in ruins. Adenauer wrote to a friend who was a theologian, in my opinion, the German people and the bishops and clergy bear a fair share of the blame for the events in the concentration camps. The Jewish pogroms of 1933, what we've just been talking about, and 1938, Kristallnacht, happened in full public view. I believe that if all the bishops had publicly protested from their pulpits on a given day, much could have been avoided. This did not happen, and there is no excuse for it. Well, of course, we have to be honest. There was no chance for that to happen. None. Given the mindset of Catholic bishops and the mindset of the Protestant Church hierarchy. Because of their anti-Semitism, because they liked the Nazi regime, so there was never a chance. But protest would have made a difference. One other point. In my lectures on Nazi Germany and other classes, I often get asked, and people say, well, how come, since you are telling us here that the Nazis made no bones about their ultimate goals, how come that not more people did leave? Multifaceted answer. Number one, as I said, German Jews were deeply rooted in German society, invested in it. They were far more German than the Nazis. They belonged to prominent families. They were often benefactors within the cities in which they lived. It was difficult. They hoped that the madness would stop, and quite interesting, by 1936, 3 years later, about 50 to 60,000 German Jews had left. But in the meantime, 10,000 had all also come back. So it's barely known that German Jews who left Germany then also came back to Nazi Germany because they just couldn't succeed abroad. Next point, we have to keep in mind that German Jews were also considered Germans. In other words, when they went to Belgium or France or Italy, well, people thought, well, this guy 15 years ago fought against us. So they were not received with open arms. Europe was, of course, at the time, for good reason, Germanophobe, and German refugees, even if they were Jewish, were not received with open arms. Then another paradox, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, please keep in mind, Germany was not considered a very anti-Semitic country. Before 1914 was the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, even the French Republic, because of the Dreyfus affair, that were generally considered to be more anti-Semitic. So many people in Nazi Germany, many German Jews thought, well, this can't go on forever. And then finally, of course, there was the question of languages. At the time, educated Germans knew Latin, of course. They may even have read ancient Greek, Italian, French, but English, language of commerce. Yeah? So, yeah, people didn't really speak English, so it was difficult, very, very difficult to leave. I just recently reread Peter Gay, you know the famous Yale historian who died about 10 years ago, My German Question. He was born in Berlin in 1923, and then he said, in the book he mentions quite often that I'm so annoyed when I hear American Jews telling me, why didn't you leave sooner? He and his family got out in 1939, at the very last moment. And he said, well, because we loved Germany. We were very German. And we thought this can't be true. It's a great book, by the way, very readable, My German Question. Well, let me stop here. I don't want to go on forever. Very happy to take questions.